Good morning. Okay, I'm going to continue reading Monty Johnstone's 1967 article, Marx and Engels and the Concept of the Party, beginning with part 4. I think there's 4 parts remaining, so we'll see how far I can get. I might read 2, I might read the remainder, we'll see. So, part 4. The formation of the First International in 1864. My dog just decided to make some noise. His name's Freddie, after Frederick Engels. Freddie. Can you see him? Okay, sorry for the interruption. Part 4. The formation of the First International in 1864 gave Marx, and somewhat later Engels, the opportunity to break out of their relative isolation and join up with the Western European labor movement that was now reviving on a much wider scale than its continental predecessor of the 1840s. Whilst not abandoning his theoretical work, Marx turned his attention more and more, right up to the Hague Conference of 1872, to organizing, uniting, and leading this broad international federation of affiliated working class organizations. Like the Communist League, the International was not founded by Marx and Engels, but sprang spontaneously from the labor movement of the time, to which, by virtue of their theoretical and intellectual preeminence, they came to give direction and perspective. Unlike the Communist League, however, they did not at any stage regard the International as a communist party, nor did they operate with their supporters as an organized party, fraction, or secret society inside the broad framework of the International. Nonetheless, in speaking in the inaugural address of the International of Numbers United by Combination and Led by Knowledge, Marx was broadly paraphrasing his party concept of the fusion of socialist theory with the labor movement, and in the International, especially after the Paris Commune, he and Engels were to develop more fully than hitherto their views on party organization. In contrast to the Communist League with its advanced theoretical program, Marx framed the International's program, the preamble to its rules that he drew up, quote, in a form acceptable from the present standpoint of the workers' movement, as he told Engels. This movement had to embrace the liberal leaders of the British trade unions, the French, Italian, and Spanish Proudhonists, and the German Lassalleans. It admitted both individual members and affiliated organizations. The principle that it should let every section freely shape its own theoretical program led Marx to propose the acceptance of the sections of Bakunin's International Alliance of Socialist Democracy into the International, which it applied to enter in 1868, despite his very strong objections to its program and suspicions from the outset of Bakunin's motives in joining. In the early years of the International, in drawing up its documents, Marx restricted himself, quote, to those points which allow of immediate agreement and concerted action by the workers, and give direct nourishment and impetus to the requirements of the class struggle and the organization of the workers into a class. He realized at the start that it would take time before the reawakened movement allows of the old boldness of speech. However, relying for the ultimate triumph of the ideas set forth in the manifesto solely and exclusively upon the intellectual development of the working class, as it necessarily had to ensue from united action and discussion. He succeeded as the movement developed in gaining support for demands of an increasingly socialist character. Thus, by 1868, despite a dwindling Proudhonist opposition, the International, which began without any commitment to public ownership, had come out officially for collective ownership of the mines, railways, arable land, forests, and means of communication. The Paris Commune in the spring of 1871, memorably vindicated by Marx on behalf of the General Council in The Civil War in France, raised very sharply the question of the most effective forms of political action to secure working-class political power, which the growth of working-class suffrage, as well as the abstentionist campaign being run by the Bakuninists in the International, had also helped to make topical. After a discussion in which both Marx and Engels participated, the London Conference adopted its famous Resolution 9, quoted at the beginning of this essay, with which for the first time in its history the International officially came out in favor of the constitution of the working class into a political party. This objective was incorporated into the rules of the International at its Hague Conference a year later. What is meant here, however, by this much quoted but little analyzed formulation? In his very stimulating and well documented, but often contentious, study of the London Conference, Dr. Miklos Molnar of Geneva interprets this resolution, along with those dealing with dues and statistics, as preparing the ground for the International to, quote, become a sort of centralized international party. Whilst up till then Marx had seen it as a network of affiliated societies, Molnar argues that he later conceived, and at the London Conference openly came out with, quote, the idea of transforming all these societies and heterogeneous groupings into an international party. Molnar is unable to quote any statements from Marx or Engels to support his interpretation of the London Conference resolution, and he ignores some very solid evidence indicating that they intended something quite different by it. Thus, in 1893, Engels was to welcome the formation of the Independent Labour Party in Britain, saying that this new party was the very party which the old members of the International desired to see formed when they passed their resolution at the 1871 conference, in favor of an independent political party. Further in the leaflet, the Manchester Foreign Section to all sections and members of the British Federation, that Engels drafted in December 1872, he wrote that the resolution, quote, merely demands the formation in every country of a distinct working class party opposed to all middle class parties. That is to say, he continues, it calls here in England upon the working class to refuse any longer to serve as the fag end of the great Liberal party and to form an independent party of their own, as they did in the glorious times of the great Chartist movement. Thus we are back to the model of the mass Chartist movement, quote, the first working men's party of modern times, which, as explained above, was what the authors of the Communist Manifesto had in mind when they spoke there of the organization of the proletarians into a class, and consequently into a political party. By 1871, Marx and Engels also had another more recent model in mind. This was the German Social Democratic Workers' Party, formed at Eisenach 2 years earlier. The anti-war stand taken by its leaders, Bebel and Liebknecht, in the Reichstag the previous year, were cited by Marx at the London Conference as an example of the importance of having workers' representatives in national parliaments, as they have as they had been by Engels when he wrote to the Spanish Federal Council of the International on the 13th of February 1871. In this important letter, written just before the Paris Commune, Engels argues that experience has shown everywhere that the best way to emancipate the workers from this domination of the old parties is to form in each country a proletarian party with a policy of its own, a policy quite distinct from that of the other parties. Thus, from 1871, Marx and Engels envisaged the International working for the establishment of independent national workers' parties. They had no wish to prescribe one form or another, neither the more Marxist, in quotes, type of party, like the Eisenachers, who had developed under the influence of their theoretical views, nor the less theoretically developed but more broadly based Chartist movement as the model for all countries. Nor were they aiming, as Molnar asserts, at having the International provided with a common doctrine. The common theoretical program that Marx had foreseen in 1869 being created by degrees by the exchange of ideas throughout the International was conceived in fairly broad terms. 2 days after the close of the London Conference, Marx made a speech at a dinner for the delegates in which he stressed that the International had not put forth any particular creed. Its task was to organize the forces of labor and link the various working men's movements and combine them. Ironically enough, a full report of this speech is reproduced by Molnar as an appendix. Even at the end of August 1872, at the height of the most bitter battle with the anarchists, to whose theories Marx and Engels personally were irreconcilably opposed, Engels made it clear that they considered that Bakunin and his followers had the right within the International to carry out propaganda for their program. The conflict between Marx and Bakunin, as Julius Bronthal points out in his Geschichte der Internationale, was set alight not by theoretical contradictions, but on the question of the organization of the International. His libertarian demagogy notwithstanding, Bakunin sought to place that organization under the unseen and irresponsible tutelage of a hierarchically organized secret society or societies. If you form this collective and invisible dictatorship, you will triumph. The well-led revolution will triumph. If not, it won't, he wrote on the 1st of April 1870 to his supporter Albert Richard. The real issue at stake between Marx and Bakunin was whether the International should be run as a public, democratic organization in accordance with rules and policies laid down at its congresses, or whether it should allow Bakunin to paralyze its action by secret intrigue, and federations and sections to refuse to accept Congress decisions with which they disagreed. Although Marx and Engels at times undoubtedly overestimated the actual ramifications of Bakuninist secret societies, it was sometimes difficult for the old conspirator himself to keep track of them all and to distinguish between reality and the fantastic projects of his scheming brain. And were guilty in the heat of battle of some polemical exaggeration and inadequately substantiated personal attacks, none of which, however, descended to the level of the anti-Semitic venom that this supposed internationalist injected into his abuse of Marx. Bakunin gave them ample grounds for rallying their forces to secure his defeat and expulsion at the Hague Congress in September of 1872. It's early, I need my coffee, sorry. Marx's and Engels's proposals for increased powers for the General Council, adopted at that Congress, should not be seen as aiming to implement a version of the Mazziniist proposal for a sort of central government of the European working classes, of which Marx had secured the rejection at the beginning of the International, nor the thoroughly authoritarian leadership understood by the French Blanquists in their demand for the International to be the international vanguard of the proletarian revolution, and their criticism of it after the Hague Conference for being too much of a parliamentary institution. All that they were proposing was that the right of the General Council to expel sections voted at by the Basel Congress of 1869, with Bakunin's wholehearted support, should be extended to include federations, but under conditions which, as Marx emphasized, subjected the actions of the General Council to a check. In the aftermath of the Paris Commune, faced with persecution from the reactionary forces of Europe and disruption from the Bakuninists, Marx and Engels had no alternative but to fight to give the International an effective centralized leadership. Yet in doing so, they precipitated its end. Their proposals provided Bakunin with a popular anti-authoritarian plank for mobilizing opposition to the General Council in Switzerland, Italy, Spain, and Belgium, with which a substantial portion of the British, who had supported Marx earlier against the Proudhonists and had no anarchist sympathies, were to associate themselves. Rather than risk a General Council under the control in the immediate future of the Blanquists, with whom they had to ally themselves to defeat Bakunin, or perhaps later of Bakuninists, they persuaded the Hague Conference to transfer its seat to New York. This Congress, as Engels was to recognize by the autumn of 1874, had marked effectively the end of the First International. The proletarian world, he wrote, had become too big, too extensive, for such an alliance of all the proletarian parties in every country to recur. The next International, he thought, after the influence of Marx's writings had spread, would be directly communist, and will openly proclaim our principles. Paradoxically, a major factor preventing the revival of the First International that Marx and Engels had hoped for in the first period after the Hague Conference was the development of the national workers' parties, of which its new statutes were designed to promote the growth, but with which in practice their development as autonomous organizations tended to clash. Molnar is right when he says of these parties that the International gave birth to them and died for them and died from them. Dr. Roger Morgan, in his very well documented study of the first and most important of them, has shown in detail how the emergence of the Eisenach Party, replacing as it had to the International's German language group led by J.P. Becker from Geneva, led to a dropping off of the direct activities of the International in Germany, through the Eisenachers' preoccupation with their own national campaigns. Marx and Engels never stuck to a given organizational form if they thought the real movement had outgrown it and it had become a fetter on its further development. Although their stand in 1871 through 72 did not save the First International, it did help to provide political and organizational principles for the new parties that were to emerge and, in most cases, take on a more or less Marxist character. It also helped to ensure that the Second International, finally formed with Engels' enthusiastic support in 1889, although not directly communist, was very strongly influenced by Marxism. Commenting on the unanimous decision of its Second Congress in 1891 to exclude the representatives of the anarchist groups, Engels wrote, "With this, the old international came to an end. With this, the new one begins again." It is purely and simply the ratification 19 years later of the Hague Congress resolutions. Thrilling stuff. Part 5. When in 1863 Lassalle founded the General German Workers' Union, he performed, in Marx's view, an immortal service by reawakening the independent workers' movement after 15 years of slumber. Yet, although recognizing what was positive in such an independent workers' organization as the ADAV, the German abbreviation, and for a short time in 1864 through 5 contributing to its journal, he and Engels generally described it as a workers' sect rather than a workers' party. They saw the Lassallean attempt to prescribe to the workers the course to be followed according to a certain dogmatic recipe. Its inadequate agitation, at least before 1868, for full political freedom, its leadership cult, and the strict organization which the ADAV tried to carry even into the trade unions that they set up, as expressions of its sectarian character. Opposing all this, Marx wrote in 1868 to ADAV President Schweitzer that, especially in Germany, where the worker is bureaucratically disciplined from childhood up and believes in authority and the bodies placed over him, it is above all important to teach him to act independently. From 1865, Marx concentrated on the formation of sections of the International in Germany, to which individual members were recruited. He saw these as preparing the ground for a national workers' party, the creation of which was being facilitated by Bismarck's surge forward to German unification. An important ideological contribution to this was made by the publication, exactly a century ago in 1967, of the first volume of Capital, with which Marx hoped to raise the party, with a capital P, to raise the party as high as possible, and which the next year was greeted at the national congresses, the two major German workers' organizations, the ADAV and the Association of German Workers' Organizations, led by Bebel and Liebknecht. At a congress in Eisenach in 1869, Bebel's association joined with opposition elements in the ADAV to form the German Social Democratic Workers' Party, on the basis of a program that showed the influence of Marxism, although its demand for a free people's state and certain Lassallean formulations did not meet with the approval of Marx and Engels. Whilst in some respects not as directly socialist as the ADAV, the new party had over it the great advantage, in Marx and Engels' eyes, of being unambiguously opposed to Bismarck's nationalism and the Prussian military state, and of being organized along thoroughly democratic lines. In it, Marx and Engels came to recognize a genuine proletarian party, and for the first time since the dissolution of the Communist League in 1852, to apply the expression "our party" to an organized political party of the day. When in 1875 a unity congress was arranged at Gotha between the two German workers' organizations and a draft program for the new party was issued, Marx and Engels wrote their famous criticisms of its theoretical insufficiencies, for private consideration by the leaders of the Eisenachers. Every step of a real movement is more important than a dozen programs, wrote Marx. If, therefore, it was not possible to go beyond the Eisenach program, one should simply have concluded an agreement for action against the common enemy. Despite these misgivings, Marx and Engels associated themselves with the new United Party, and before very long had come to refer to it too as our party. And at the end of his life, Engels was praising the fusion for the immense increase in strength that it had brought about. Whilst rejoicing at the impressive growth of the new party, Marx and Engels always took up the cudgels when they saw signs of a vulgarization of party and theory in its ranks. Thus, in September 1879, they sent a strongly worded circular to party leaders criticizing their conciliatory attitude toward certain representatives of the petty bourgeoisie, who were attempting to combat the proletarian character of the party and thereby acting as an adulterating element within it. They found it incomprehensible that the party could tolerate in its midst any longer people who were saying that the workers were too uneducated to emancipate themselves. In 1882, Engels wrote to Bebel that he had no illusions that it would one day come to a dispute with the bourgeois-inclined elements in the party and to a separation between the right and left wings, preferably after the anti-socialist law that had been introduced in 1878 had been repealed. In the last years of his life, Engels approved in its broad essentials the line followed by the party and the new program that it adopted, after he had criticized its first draft at the Erfurt Congress in 1891. He expressed his pride in our electoral successes, which in 1893 he saw approaching the 2 million mark, and over-optimistically predicted an electoral majority and a socialist government in power between 1900 and 1910. He wasn't really that far off. Side note. In 1895, a few months before his death, he worked out in his introduction to The Class Struggles in France of 1848 through 1850 by Marx, the theoretical justification of the entirely new method of proletarian struggle that had been opened up by the successful utilization of universal suffrage, relegating to the past the time of surprise attacks, of revolutions carried through by small conscious minorities at the head of unconscious masses. However, he stressed to Paul Lafargue that the tactics outlined there could not be followed in their entirety in France, Belgium, Italy, and Austria, and that in Germany they may become inapplicable tomorrow. Engels considered the designation social democratic inappropriate for a party whose economic program is not merely generally socialist, but directly communist, and whose ultimate political objective is the abolition of the whole state, and thus also of democracy. Professor Harold Lasky, in his introduction to the Labour Party's centenary edition of the Communist Manifesto, was unable to recognize that Marx and Engels developed their concept of the party further after 1848. The idea of a separate communist party dates from the Russian Revolution, he asserts. It had no place in the thought of either Marx or of Engels, who, for instance, he argues, never sought to found a separate German communist party. He does not see that for them, German communism, which as Engels wrote to Sorge in 1864, did not yet exist as a workers' party, gradually came to do so after. Let me restart that. He does not see that, for them, German communism, which, as Engels wrote to Sorge in 1864, did not yet exist as a workers' party, gradually came to do so after 1869, in the shape of the socialist parties led by Bebel and Liebknecht. Nor do the views of Marx and Engels on the development of a Marxist party in France in the same period lend any support to Lasky's sweeping assertion that they will always support working class parties, even when these are not communist, without forming a separate party of their own, regardless of the fact that such a party may have an inadequate program. In fact, in 1882, Engels gave his support to Guede and the left-wing minority when they walked out of the Saint Etienne Congress of the French Workers' Party, which then split into a Guedeist and a Possibilist party. He described this separation of incompatible elements as inevitable and good. Writing to Bernstein, he reported that the possibilist right wing had replaced the communist preamble of the 1880 party program drafted by Marx by the rules of the International of 1866, which, he said, had to be framed so broadly because the French Proudhonists were so backward, and still it would not have been right to exclude them. If, like the possibilists, you created a party without a program, which everyone can join, then it isn't a party anymore, he argued. To be for a moment in a minority with a correct program, quoad organization, is still better than to have a big, but thereby almost nominal semblance of a following. About half an hour in. I'd really like to continue going. I think I can make it through the final two sections this morning. I think I have time. I have to go to work soon. Okay, let's do it. Section 6. The idea of a broad labor party, favored by Marx and Engels in the case of Britain and the United States of America, and developed most fully by the latter after his friend's death, when in the 1880s and 90s a spontaneous labor movement sprang into life in both countries, would seem to be exactly what they were opposing in Germany and France. Thus, writing to Florence Kelly Vishnevetsky, I think I said that right, Florence Kelly Vishnevetsky, at the end of 1886, Engels says that in the forthcoming American elections, 1 million or 2 of working men's votes for a bona fide working men's party is worth infinitely more at present than 100,000 votes for a doctrinally perfect program. Whilst he had no illusions about the theoretical backwardness of the Knights of Labor and of Henry George, whose banner this party had set up, he did not think the time had arrived to make a full criticism of either of them. Anything that might delay or prevent that national consolidation of the working men's party, no matter on what platform, I should consider a great mistake, he explained. This should take place through the unification of the various independent bodies into one national labor army, he wrote in his preface to the American edition of the 1887 of his Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844. It should have the conquest of the capital and the White House for its goal. In a series of articles in the Labor Standard in 1881, Engels had urged the British labor movement to form its own working men's political party and send its own representatives to Parliament. with a brilliant anticipation of the form of organization to be adopted 2 decades later by the Labor Party. He wrote, "At the side of or above the unions of special trades, there must spring up a general union, a political organization of the working class as a whole." When, out of the militant upsurge of 1888 through 89, and the first successes of independent labor candidates in 1892, the Independent Labor Party was formed in 1893, Engels publicly urged all socialists to join it, believing that, if wisely led, it would eventually absorb every other socialist organization. Although there were all sorts of funny people among the ILP leaders, he wrote to Sorga at this time, "The masses are behind them and will either teach them manners or throw them overboard." The new party's development in the next 2 years, however, did not live up to his expectations, and by the beginning of 1895 he saw among the British workers nothing but sects and no party. Engels was clearly judging the new party not by the criterion of its adherence to the theory of Marxism, but by the extent to which it was a distinct workers' party, promoting and reflecting the masses' own movement, no matter in what form, so long as it is only their own movement. Their own movement. Such very disparate weight given to the importance of a correct theoretical understanding, to the character of the party program, and the breadth of its appeal, as those given by Engels and Marx in relation to Germany and France on the one hand, and to Britain and America on the other, certainly indicate two different conceptions of the proletarian party. The differences are not, however, absolute, and do not represent some inexplicable contradiction in the thought of the founders of scientific socialism. On the contrary, they will be seen as logically complementary if we examine their application, in each case, on the basis of Engels's explanation in the letter to Mrs. Kelly Vishnevetsky, quoted above, that our theory is not a dogma, but the exposition of a process of evolution, and that process involves successive phases. Britain and the USA were at this time both countries with substantial industrial working classes that had developed important and often militant industrial organizations, but where those who had understood anything of socialism were a tiny handful. Here then was an analogy, as Engels pointed out to Sorga, with the part played by the Communist League among the workers' associations before 1848 in Germany. And here it was therefore perfectly consistent for him to recommend that American Marxists should act in the same way as the European socialists have acted at a time when they were but a small minority of the working class, at the time that the Communist Manifesto indicated that the communists did not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. Since 1848, however, the position on the continent had advanced considerably. Germany in 1869, and to a lesser extent France in 1880, had reached the stage of having parties developing roots among the working class on the basis of a more or less developed socialist program, and any attempt to fuse with other organizations or to win more votes through adulterating or scrapping such programs seemed to Marx and Engels to represent a decidedly retrograde step. But for Britain and America, where the workers had been bound politically to bourgeois parties, any move toward a broad united party of their own, on however backward a theoretical basis, was an advance, the next great step to be accomplished. It was the self-imposed isolation of the main organized bodies of Marxists in the two countries that led Engels to criticize them for being and acting only like sects, which contrived to reduce the Marxist theory of development into a rigid dogma. It was fundamentally his objection to such Anglo-Saxon sectarianism, rather than pique at Heidemann's tactless behavior, as Cole and Postgate, and after them Carew Hunt, blandly assert, that was responsible for Engels dissociating himself from the Social Democratic Federation in Britain, as from the Socialist Labor Party in the United States. However, he thought that these organizations, having accepted our theoretical program and so acquired a basis, would have a role to play if they worked among the still quite plastic mass of workers as a core of people who understand the movement and its aims and will therefore themselves take over the leadership at a later stage. Experience had shown that it is possible to work along with the general movement of the working class at every one of its stages without giving up or hiding our own distinct position or even organization. The Marxists would then have a big contribution to make to the emergence of the ultimate platform of the labor movement in their countries, which must and will be essentially the same as that now adopted by the whole militant working class of Europe. At such a stage, Engels doubtless foresaw the coming into being of a new party, such as more than 4 decades previously he had predicted would arise from the union of socialism and Chartism, the reproduction of French communism in an English manner, by the fusion of the theoretically more backward, less developed, but genuinely proletarian Chartists with the more far-seeing socialists, to make the working class the true intellectual leader of their country. Part 7. Far from discarding the notion of party to return to the notion of class, as Sorel asserts, Marx and Engels saw the party as a moment in the development of the proletariat, without which it cannot act as a class. For the working class to be strong enough to win on the decisive day, Engels wrote to Trier in 1889, it must form a separate party distinct from all others and oppose to them a conscious class party, adding with some simplification that this was what Marx and I have been arguing ever since 1847. In 1865, in The Prussian Military Question and the German Workers' Party, which he discussed with Marx before publication, Engels defines the Workers' Party, with which he is not in the pamphlet prepared to identify the only existing workers' organization of the time, the Lassallean ADAV, as that part of the working class that has attained consciousness of the separate interests of the class. When they sometimes speak loosely of the proletarian party as though it were identical with the class as a whole, it would seem clear from the contexts that they are referring synecdochically to the class, when they refer when what they mean in fact is its politically active portion. Let me read that again. When they sometimes speak loosely of the proletarian party as though it were identical with the class as a whole, it would seem clear from the contexts that they are referring synecdochically to the class, when what they mean in fact is its politically active portion, which more and more of the class will come to support as it matures for its self-emancipation. Theoretical consciousness and the Selbsttätigkeit, spontaneous self-activity, of the working class are present as the key elements in their conception of the proletarian party in all periods of Marx's and Engels's thought and activity from 1844 on, combining in different proportions in different conditions. They always represent complementary factors in the Marxian conception of the evolution of the proletariat to full maturity and Selbstbewusstsein, consciousness. Part of my German pronunciation as well. They always represent complementary factors in the Marxian conception of the evolution of the proletariat to full maturity and Selbstbewusstsein, consciousness, rather than expressing a dualism in Marx's thought, as Maximilian Rubel of Paris argues. Rubel tries to fit Marx's conception of the party into the Procrustean bed of the highly disputable theory that there is in his work a fundamental ambiguity between his materialist sociology and a utopian ethic that he inherited, and that serves as his postulate for social revolution. With the aid of quotations collected totally ahistorically from a wide range of Marx's and Engels's writings between 1841 and 1895, he seeks to distinguish a double conception of the proletarian party in their work, differentiating between the sociological concept of the Workers' Party on the one hand and the ethical concept of the Communist Party on the other. Karl Marx, asserts Rubel, distinguishes formally between the Workers' Party and the body, or ensemble, of communists whose task is of a theoretical and educative order. The communists are thus in no wise called to properly political functions. Being a form of non-institutionalized representation, which represents the proletarian movement in the historical sense of the term, the latter cannot identify themselves with a real organization subject to the constraints of political alienation and obeying formally established rules and statutes. The class movement of the proletariat, says Rubel, cannot be identified with the political agitation of parties. On the contrary, he goes on, it is represented by the trade unions, if these understand their revolutionary role and fulfill it faithfully. This last assertion, endeavoring to present Marx and Engels as syndicalists, completely ignores inter alia Marx's and Engels's rejection before the Eisenach Congress of just such an argument by Johann Philipp Becker. Old Becker must have gone right off his rocker, Engels wrote to Marx then. How can he decree that the trades union has to be the true workers' association and the basis for all organization? The Manifesto of the Communist Party, from which Rubel quotes, as well as the whole history of its author's party work on which we have drawn, shows absolutely clearly and explicitly that they saw the communists using their theoretical foresight, which for Rubel is some sort of transcendental ethical quality far removed from the corrupting political struggle, precisely to act politically, to push forward and give leadership in the political struggles of their time. Moreover, the manifesto was issued as the program of the Communist League, a political organization obeying formally established rules and statutes. Only in the most exceptional and temporary periods did the communists operate outside a real organization, although, as in the case of the First International, that organization did not always need to be a communist party. The latter differed from other working class parties in that it had a communist program and was guided by communist theory. However, believing that the workers, from out of their own class feeling, would work their way up to an acceptance of Marxist theory, and with the help of those whose minds are theoretically clear, to shorten the process considerably, Marx and Engels thought that sooner or later many of these other parties would either come to adopt communist programs or be absorbed by others that had. In this belief, they were strengthened at the end of their lives by the example of German social democracy that was developing into the type of essentially communist mass party towards which they believed the other workers' parties, from their different starting points and in their own national forms, would ultimately advance. They saw such a fully developed proletarian party representing the fusion of socialist theory not just with a tiny handful of advanced workers, as in the Communist League, but with large and growing sections of the working class. Marx and Engels saw the fullest possible internal democracy as an essential feature of a proletarian party. Disturbed by expulsions from the Danish Socialist Party of leading left-wing opponents of its leadership, Engels wrote to Trier in the letter quoted above, the workers' movement is based on the sharpest criticism of existing society. Criticism is its vital element. How, then, can it avoid criticism? Try to forbid controversies. Is it possible for us to demand from others freedom of speech for ourselves only in order to eliminate it afresh in our own ranks? When in 1890 the German party leadership reacted in a high-handed way to the opposition of the so-called Jungen, with whom Engels disagreed politically, expressed through 4 social democratic papers they controlled, he wrote to Sorge, "The party is so big that absolute freedom of debate inside it is a necessity. The greatest party in the land cannot exist without all shades of opinion in it making themselves fully felt." For Engels, such internal democracy, diversity, and debate did not contradict, but was demanded by German social democracy's existence as the strongest, best disciplined, and most rapidly growing socialist party, just as obversely he and Marx had at a certain stage in the history of the First International seen a stronger general council with disciplinary powers to use in exceptional cases as a condition for its democratic functioning. Marx's famous principle that the emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves, on which he and Engels insisted again and again, is complemented, not contradicted, by their concept of the party. The German Social Democratic Workers' Party, just because it is a workers' party, necessarily pursues a class policy, the policy of the working class, Engels wrote in 1873 in The Housing Question. Since each political party sets out to establish its rule in the state, so the German Social Democratic Workers' Party is necessarily striving to establish its rule, the rule of the working class, the rule of the working class, hence class domination. The organization by the proletariat of its own party was the primary condition of the struggle of the working class, and the dictatorship of the proletariat the immediate aim. Marx and Engels never went further than this in discussing the relationship of the proletarian party to their conception of proletarian dictatorship, which they saw as representing a political transition period between capitalism and communism. There is nothing in their work to justify Stalin's attempt to present as Marxist his theory that socialism demands a one-party system, least of all in the form operated by him, where a small tyrannical clique substituted itself for the working class in laying some of the foundations of socialism. On the contrary, Engels's criticism of Blanqui is directed precisely against such a regime. Quote, "From Blanqui's conception of every revolution as the coup de main of a small revolutionary minority," he wrote in 1874, "follows of itself the necessity of a dictatorship after it succeeds. The dictatorship, of course, not of the whole revolutionary class, the proletariat, but of the small number of those who carried out the coup, and who are themselves already in advance organized under the dictatorship of one or a few individuals." Certainly the Paris Commune, which Marx described as the conquest of the political power of the working classes, and Engels as the dictatorship of... being messaged. Let me begin that sentence again. It's too good to be interrupted. Certainly the Paris Commune, which Marx described as the conquest of the political power of the working classes, and Engels as the dictatorship of the proletariat, by which he meant the same thing, was no one-party state, and was based on the election of all officials by universal suffrage, and measures to safeguard itself against its own deputies and officials, by declaring them all, without exception, subject to recall at any moment. The late Mr. Carew Hunt, in his book Marxism Past and Present, is on peculiarly weak ground when he bases his statement on the well-worn argument that the one-party system was written into Marx's doctrine of dictatorship, on the assertion that it is conceivable that Marx, who would go to any lengths to crush a socialist opponent, would have permitted adversaries to organize themselves politically to defeat the objects for which the revolution had been carried out. The main example that Carew Hunt obviously has in mind is that of Bakunin and his supporters, of whose appearance in the First International, E. H. Carr writes, "The wooden horse had entered the Trojan citadel." In a letter to Bolta in 1873, Marx wrote, "In open opposition to the International, these people do no harm, but are useful. But as hostile elements inside it, they ruin the movement in all countries where they have got a foothold." He and Engels rejected the Bakuninists' argument that the International, forced to meet the needs of day-to-day struggle against capitalism, could be organized to accord as closely as possible with a future libertarian society. Whilst Marx and Engels would certainly have taken exceptional authoritarian measures against reactionary opponents in a civil war or a pro-slavery rebellion, there are no grounds for arguing that they would have favored the suppression of political opposition and dissent as a normal feature of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The role of the proletarian party is circumscribed by the very conception of dialectics and historical development put forward by Marx and Engels. Born at a certain moment in the life of the working class, evolving in step with the different stages in the development of that class in different countries and periods, and in its turn reacting on and speeding up this development, its success in helping to establish working class power would lay the basis for its own disappearance. Working class power, by raising the consciousness of the widest sections of the population, by a big educational expansion, by establishing really democratic institutions, which would see the people acting for itself by itself, could be assumed gradually to close the gap between a growing educated and trained core of hundreds of thousands in the party and the rest of the class, removing the raison d'etre of the former conceived as a separate echelon. Finally, though Marx had no illusions that this would take place quickly, the economic measures taken by the proletariat in power would end its rule by abolishing its existence as a class, and with it, the existence of the state in the present political sense. In the association which will exclude classes and their antagonism, to which Marx believed the transitional working class dictatorship would give way, the continued existence of a proletarian party would clearly be an anachronism. And that's the essay. So I'm sorry I was a little tongue-tied at certain points there. It's, like I said, is early, but I really wanted to finish that while I had some momentum. I'm about to start my work week, and I won't have much time to post this sort of thing until my next weekend, which is Monday and Tuesday. Yeah, so I think this is an invaluable piece of writing, and anyone who's interested in the legacy of Marxism and the socialist movement more generally, and not, I don't mean the legacy simply in the sense of the past of the sense in which these are things from the past, but the sense in which this legacy lives on in some way in the present, at least in the sense that some people have an interest in drawing further consequences from it, from making it live on in some way beyond its present condition as a kind of remnant or relic. I think this is an invaluable essay just because of how rigorously clear it is in laying out what is undoubtedly a very confusing topic when viewed in retrospect, when kind of understood only through, from the standpoint of the present, which is lacking any real continuity with this tradition, tries to sift through the various, literary remains of this tradition, the various pages on Marxist.org, for the most part. It's very hard to make sense of what was really going on and what Marx and Engels were trying to do. They didn't write a rigorous theory of the party because they were, in a sense, living that theorization. They were working it out in practice through their activities as they engaged with the movement of their time, or lack thereof, depending on what point in their lives we're discussing. And it's not as simple as doing that one thing that Marx and Engels figured out needed to be done. It's far more complicated a proposition than that. It's about engaging with the existing reality in terms of a broader conception of the historical process of which it's a part, in order to work through the obstacles existing within the present to the further progress of that historical process to a potential goal that we can take up and realize if we render that goal a conscious aim to be the orienting, the kind of point of orientation towards which our activity in the present is directed. I think if there's any kind of analogy to any period in Marx and Engels's life to be drawn in the present, it would be the period after the defeat of the revolutions of 1848 through 1850, so the 1850s up to the early 1860s, in which the revolutionary movement was desolated, it was laid waste, and the few clinging to the revolutionary tradition were these sort of idealistic to the point of delusion sectarians like Willich and Schopper, who Marx and Engels left behind, and happily so, to prefer the freedom of the independent writer and researcher. Not because Marx and Engels preferred that position to the prospect of building a revolutionary party, but because they saw the sort of voluntarist, if you will, and sectarian notion that you could simply build that party without regard to the conditions in which you were building it and the meaning that that organization might have to the society you were trying to lead and lead into a revolution. It was just kind of out of step with reality. So from in the 1850s and early 1860s, Marx and Engels were more concerned, well, Marx in particular was more concerned, besides his journalism, which as interesting as it is, was done for economic purposes. It was done for because he needed to make a living. He was much more interested in his research into political economy and other related subjects. Not as an end in itself, but to clarify the task of proletarian revolution in as thoroughgoing a manner possible, so that when the upsurge of revolutionary potential returned, which they were confident it eventually would, they could orient that upsurge with the most thoroughly clarified consciousness of its historical task that they could possibly offer. And Marx and Engels saw themselves as it were, the self-appointed heads of the proletarian party when it was not a real organization, but just this sort of, this kind of transcendental orienting prospect for the future. They saw themselves appointed by their own clarity of understanding, which of course they may very well have been wrong. Maybe someone else would have had a more accurate understanding. Maybe LaSalle, for example, had a more accurate understanding. But the point would be that that would be proven in practice by its ability to win over and to orient the most advanced sections of the working class, and through winning them over, to arm them with the means to carry the rest of the class into movement through their leadership. Right now, even in the 1850s, as low of a point as that was, there was nonetheless, especially in places like England and France, but also increasingly in Germany, and other parts of Europe as well, and the United States for that matter, there was still a sense of a divergence, if not an outright contradiction, between the interests of the working class and the capitalist class that had developed since the Industrial Revolution. And of course, the parts of Europe and, as well, the United States, specifically after the Civil War, the effects of that revolution and the resulting divergence of interests was more and more palpable as the effects of that revolution became more transformative on those parts of the world. So there was this sense that there was a growing apart of two parts of the third estate of the bourgeois society that had been brought into existence by the revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries. And this growing apart was most acutely to be observed in the destruction of the middle class and its kind of rendering asunder into this proletarianized mass of wage laborers and this ever smaller and more isolated and more haughty and aristocratic, group of capitalists. There was the embryo of a kind of class consciousness that could only really be clarified into self-consciousness of the historical task that made this divergence a historical necessity, through the political organization of the working class to take power, to dominate society in its own interests, but also in the interests of all of humanity, based on Marx's kind of vision of the classless society as the culminating trajectory of the working class's political aspirations. Today, however, as a result of the far more immense and catastrophic failure of the revolutions of the early 20th century, which make the counter-revolutionary period of the 1850s look like, a little passing rainstorm compared to, a world-shattering apocalypse. Compared to that, the aftermath that we're now dealing with is far more daunting in many ways, and certainly in the United States, which, it may be different in other parts of the world, but it's very significant that in the United States, working class consciousness, in the sense of divergence between the interests of the capitalist class and the working class, that could be developed ultimately through various kinds of organization and activity into a political movement for working class power, political power, has been almost completely destroyed. That sense has been completely destroyed. And along with it, the popular consciousness of socialism has been completely liquidated, in not in the sense that people don't know what socialism means anymore, but they what they think socialism means is really the opposite of what it used to mean. They think that socialists are the defenders of the state and those that want to see the state ever more thoroughly dominate society. Whereas this was precisely the problem that Marx and Engels saw the dictatorship of the proletariat as necessary to combat. They saw the dictatorship of the proletariat not as the domination of the state by society, but the resurrection in different conditions of the liberal ideal of the subordination of the state to society, and ultimately the withering away of the need for a state in the sense of armed men enforcing the law rather than people freely obeying the law, and in that sense, the law becoming synonymous with the free activity of the people, the libertarian ideal, if you will. You know, so Marx and Engels could rely in the 1860s and 70s, and obviously they were they showed wisdom in relying upon it because it ended up working out. They could rely on this kind of remainder of a sensibility of the divergent interests of the working class and the capitalist class, through which a working class socialist movement was eventually reconstituted. But that is mostly gone now, and to the extent that it remains, there's the sense that I think there's two different ways in which people think about working class consciousness now, in a vulgar sense. Some think of working class consciousness as, kind of, in terms of like the trade union movement as it currently exists, which is basically consciousness of informed by its subordination to the Democratic Party, and hence to all of the various culture wars tropes that the Democratic Party now uses to kind of browbeat its constituents into showing their support in elections. So there's working class consciousness in the sense of belonging to existing trade unions and essentially following in line with that movement as it's presently led, namely by the Democratic Party. And then there's this other sense of working class consciousness that you could see, for example, in the support that Donald Trump gets, the so-called white working class support, which, ironically enough, at least in certain parts of the country, is represented among trade union members, even against the leadership of the trade unions, but also by obviously large numbers of people that are not union members, considering the low union membership in this country, and probably by quite a few people that, in a sort of technical sense, you might see as middle class or petty bourgeois, people that are not wage laborers per se, but maybe small business owners or things like that. So there's this kind of class consciousness in that sense. Again, I'm using that word with scare quotes attached, where the workers see themselves as allied to these sort of idealistic capitalists like Donald Trump, who want to smash the bureaucratic state and its restrictions on the freedom of economic activity of the capitalists that would benefit, in their minds, the workers by giving them more opportunity for employment. That's sadly the best that we can say in terms of where class consciousness is at the present, and neither one of those things amounts to anything like what Marx and Engels understood by that term. Above all, what Marx and Engels saw as important in the kind of embryonic beginnings of class consciousness among the wage laborers was the recognition of their independent interests, their interests independent of the capitalist class and independent of the middle class, their interests that they share as wage laborers and that are not only distinct from, but it, but you know, directly opposed to the interests of the capitalist class. So this sense that, to put it in very simplistic terms, as wages go up, profits go down, and for that matter, as wages go up, taxes go down or should go down. Whereas as profits rise, as tax and or as taxes rise, wages go down. So there's this very basic economic sense that the workers want to reclaim as large a share of the product of their labor as possible against the efforts of the capitalist class and the state, which of course represents the rule of the capitalist class, who want to retain as much of that product for themselves as possible. That's a bit of a vulgar way of thinking about it, but it is a beginning point to be built upon, and to be developed through clarification of consciousness, through education. And that education is not just for some advanced workers who are curious and intellectually vigorous, they might be just interested in that sort of theoretical clarification because they're so inclined. But for the majority, Marx and Engels thought that as they are actively engaged in the struggle to improve their conditions, initially perhaps through economic and other kinds of social organization, but ultimately through political organization, and political activity, they would be compelled to clarify their understanding in order to succeed in that task. So that would draw them ever closer to this advanced theoretical consciousness being propagated by, the most advanced sections of the workers and by the Marxists, as a kind of, you know, guiding light, guiding theoretical light. Today, we don't really have that sense of a kind of fundamental distinction, let alone opposition or antagonism between the interests of the working class on the one hand and the capitalist class, but also the bureaucracy, the professionals, the new middle class in that sense, and the state. There isn't much of an idea of this divergence. What you get is a divergence between the interests of the capitalists and the state and the bureaucracy, and the workers are split between them, siding with one or the other. But this really just confuses the issue because ultimately the capitalist class and the state and the bureaucracy have far more in common than the workers have in common with either of them. And they are ultimately on the same team, they're on the same side, they're negotiating their common interests, whatever antagonisms may develop among them. And the workers are just kind of brought to bear, as a means of adjudicating the conflicts between them. But the real conflict that is no longer really understood or manifest in any meaningful practical sense in society is the conflict between the working class and the whole ensemble of ruling class interests represented by private corporations, but also by the state and the bureaucracy, and for that matter by things as seemingly innocuous or even beneficial as like charitable nonprofit organizations and things like that. So we are lacking even really the rudiments that Marx and Engels turned to as the signs of hope for the future in the 1850s and 60s of a developing class consciousness. And it's really those rudiments that have to be reborn, reconstituted somehow. That's not a prospect that Marx and Engels were really ever faced with. And really no socialists from the 1830s and 40s up to the 1920s faced that problem. That problem became a problem from the 1930s onward, and especially by the 50s and 60s and 70s and later. But socialists never really dealt with that problem. In fact, if anything, they contributed to its worsening. But that's a topic for another time. So what we have to deal with now, among other things, is how to kindle the kind of most elementary inclinations of a sense among working people, amongst wage laborers, that they have interests amongst themselves with each other that are distinct from and opposed to equally the interests of the capitalist class organized in private industry and the capitalist class organized in the state and represented by the professional bureaucracy. We have to be able to cultivate that sense of a divergence, and part of that might be appealing to the most advanced, intellectually advanced elements among the wage laborers, and for that matter, appealing to declassed elements of the professional intellectual stratum of society that for one reason or another are unable to integrate themselves into the into the bureaucratic layer of society that they generally aspire to live through. But the fact that there are so many revolutionary socialists out there misleading these people, specifically the declassed intellectuals, is a real obstacle. That aside, dealing with that obstacle is one task. I think that's what the Platypus Affiliated Society, of which I'm a member, but this is a separate project. I think they're trying in that project to deal with that obstacle. But there's also another question, which is how do you cultivate the rudimentary elements of what could eventually become a class-conscious working class movement in the future? How do you develop among working class people the sense that they have distinct interests that, when fully developed, practically as well as intellectually, point towards the necessity of their political rule and the transformation of capitalism into communism through socialism? That's a big question, but I think, at least my sense of it, is that one thing that needs to be done and that can be done is, like Marx in the 1850s and 60s, to retain the independence of the independent writer, to maintain that sort of sense of independence from all of the existing forces in society, including the so-called socialists. No disrespect to anyone intended, but I don't think there's any meaningful socialist movement that's doing this work at present. Correct me if I'm wrong. I do think that there is, the prospect of bringing this history to bear in the present in a way that could illuminate what might be possible and what might be necessary in the future, for those who are, for whatever reason, curious enough to look into it, or to pursue it, or having stumbled upon it, to engage with it. And I do think it's a shame that, to the extent that people have any interest in this stuff at present, they tend to get smothered by the existing socialist sects who misrepresent this history and confuse people about it and turn people off of it. I'm not interested in fighting against them, or otherwise trying to combat their influence, other than to put something else out there that I think is more clarifying and more illuminating, and might inspire some people to educate themselves and to want to educate others about it. I think laying that kind of groundwork hopefully is one part of kind of cultivating the soil from which a future working class movement could grow. I'm not sure if any of that was coherent. It's kind of early, and I just kind of spontaneously giving my thoughts on this great essay. So hopefully that was helpful to somebody, and I think it was at least a little helpful to me. But if no one else, then it is what it is. If you've watched this far, thank you. I hope it was enjoyable, and yeah, I'll probably be back on video in a few days. So take care.